theory to practice, choosing the right intercultural competency tool. There have been a number of recent studies that have come out with regard to intercultural competency assessments. And we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about those, and also to talk about the process that we might recommend, that we would encourage you to consider as you go about choosing the right tool for you and your purposes. So I'm going to switch into the presentation mode and bring up the slides. But before I do, I just wanted to introduce my fellow panelists this morning, Chris Cartwright and Michael Stevens, and we'll be hearing more from each of those in just a bit. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Chris. And Chris is going to talk about intercultural competency tools in general, and just kind of give us an overview of what the rest of the session will be. So Chris, I'm handing off to you.
Thanks, Alan. Let's go to the next slide. So folks, what we're going to do is I'm giving you an overview, and in that overview, we're going to learn a little bit about what the possibilities are for doing this type of assessment work. Alan is going to present a study that a team that he served on has done on assessment tools. I'm going to present a brief study that I worked on the practice of assessing. And then we're going to move on to Mike, and he's going to give us the 10 selection questions you ought to be asking yourselves, and then we'll be open for Q&A. So we're going to learn what to look for in a tool, what tools are available, and how to choose the best tool for your purpose. In general, we want to focus in on what it is that we're going to be assessing here. And intercultural competency is the ability to engage effectively and appropriately in a variety of cultural contexts. Note the color difference and the italicizing of effective and appropriate, because that will change depending on the context and who you're engaging. The thing I like to bring out is that when you're doing this work, there are mindsets of cultural awareness and cultural specific knowledge and interaction analysis that are needed. That's the mindset. There's a heart set of attitudes, curiosity, open-mindedness, and there's a skill set of behaviors like relationship building across skills and empathy, all of which we'll be looking for. Now, in your practice, we have to understand that what we're doing here is supporting teaching and learning, pedagogy. And in that, there are ways to frame this work. Some of you will be doing work in assessing as learning and of learning. And that's where you're actually looking at your learners and trying to see where they're at and helping them learn from the assessment. That's assessment as learning. Assessment of learning is where you're looking at the impact and the outcome of your assessment. Some of you will be doing formative assessments. Those are what's happening now. I've started this. What do I see? Who's in the room? What do they know or don't know? Summative assessments are gathered toward the end. That's where we learn about where they are, what has happened and what is the results, and how do we add that up. Many will use a quantitative assessment tool. Alan studies specifically about the variety of quantitative assessment tools. Others may also choose to add in a qualitative assessment tool, looking at a portfolio of practices that a learner is doing and coding that for cultural competency. So what we also often look at with cultural competency assessment, the people in our field often look at our gap versus competency assessments. Hit a slide there, a button there, Alan. With gap assessments, you're looking at the difference between one cultural set of norms versus another. We might compare the cultural norms in Brazil to Japan, and you have to think about the peaks that will need to be climbed to understand being effective and appropriate in either one of those cultures. With a competency assessment, Alan, if you would hit the arrow button there, you're looking at the skills to engage across those. So what is your personal skill set that actually prepares you to scale either or both of those mountains of cultural nuance?
Okay, thank you, Chris, for that setup. I'm going to be sharing a recent article came out last year, title of which Reviewing a Half a Century of Measuring Cross-Cultural Competence, Aligning Theoretical Constructs and Empirical Measures. I'll note the co-authors on that study. I'm the caboose of that crew. There were 5 of us. And I'll also note that when you receive these slides, you can, that is a hyperlink on the citation, so that will take you to the study. It's an open access article, which means it's freely available, and I would encourage you to get it. I'm going to talk briefly about the high points, some of the chief characteristics of that study, but I strongly recommend you read it, and not just because I wrote it, but because I happen to think it is a really insightful article that addresses the issue of measuring. Here in the article, we call it cross-cultural competence. At COSI, we call it intercultural competence, but does a really outstanding job. And so let me talk briefly. One of the key motivations for the study was that the recognition that, one, we've been trying to measure cross-cultural or intercultural competence for a half a century. The early efforts go way back to the late 60s, early 1970s. And from that point forward, a number of different approaches, a number of different inventories and measures have been created. But there's a great deal of ambiguity between the construct. When we say intercultural competence, what do we mean? What's the nomological net? That is, what falls within the boundaries of that construct of intercultural competence? And then how it's been measured. How when we go out and when we ask questions, when we survey, quantitatively or qualitatively, what exactly are we measuring, and how does that line up? So I have your specification of the nomological network. When I say intercultural competence, I have a very specific set of characteristics, of capabilities, of traits, of attitudes in mind. And if I talk to somebody else, one of my co-authors, for example, Vas Terras, if I talk to him, he may have a different conceptualization. There may be overlap between the two, but there's likely to be some variation. So this study was trying to see what the overlap was. Can we clear up some of the ambiguity? And then the other part of that, the motivation for the study, was to see how closely conceptualizations line up with what's actually being measured. Sometimes we can say this is what we're interested in, but then when we go out and measure something, the proxy for that abstract construct, the actual thing that we measure, may or may not align with it. And I'll give you an example. We may conceptualize intercultural competency as including adaptability or flexibility. And then we may measure one aspect of that by sense of humor. We may say that's one of the components. Well, abstractly, sense of humor may relate to that. But then how did we measure sense of humor? That you told a joke? That you think something is funny? Those are the challenges. So there are 2 parts to this, and I want to emphasize that because that's going to be a theme that runs through our webinar this morning. And so then the question came as we conducted this study, how are we going to determine what actually constituted an appropriate intercultural competency instrument? And so we set 4 criteria. And I'll just say up top, we identified 105 assessment tools altogether. We ended up reviewing only 68. And the reason we did that is the criteria. First of all, we were going to only measure instruments that measured traits or attitude or worldview or capability. We were going to exclude antecedent factors. You ask, what's an antecedent factor? Well, we know that prior international experience often contributes to intercultural competence, but that's not something that we would typically typically measure in that way. That is, somebody either has that or doesn't have that. The second one, we were only interested in measures at the individual level. So this is measuring an individual, not an organization, not a group. Third, we excluded instruments that were used that had a single use or a special context focus. So for example, there are several instruments out there that are specifically targeted towards, for example, nurses and healthcare delivery. And there's evidence that there are some good measures there, but for general use, as we're talking about here, those don't apply. And then we excluded instruments for which we could not find adequate information. We had a long list of things we wanted to understand about the construct, how the construct was defined, what it included, about the statistical properties of the assessments, et cetera. And there are a number of instruments out there for which that information is not available, and so we did not include them. When it came to how did we organize and code these, we used two approaches. One I'll call TAC, TAC, which means traits, attitudes / worldview, and capabilities. So we were looking at the qualities, qualitative characteristics of what was being assessed. And then the other one was a conceptual framing, a PRS, by which I mean perception, relationship, and self. And this comes from work that was done by several partners in the COSI group, Mark Mendenhall and Gary Odu in particular, who identified those three characteristics as kind of an organizing frame for understanding the types of competencies, that is, competencies that relate to cognitive processes, perception, competencies related to our relationships and how we manage those relationships, and then competencies that relate to self and how we manage self. And so those two, using those two frameworks, we were able to identify a lot of the conceptual properties of these instruments. Following our organization, we then administered a survey to 160 subject matter expertises. These are interculturalists working either academically or professionally. And we solicited their input around certain aspects of what we're looking at. And then finally, we got into the analysis. And what we were focused on is what is the coverage? And when we look at each assessment, how well do they cover kind of a general sense of what is intercultural competency? Then we looked at measurement rigor. How rigorous is the measurement that they're using? Are these tools, as Mike will talk about, valid and reliable? And then we also looked at acceptance and use. How widely accepted are these instruments? And that led to the creation of a diagram. And what I'm showing here is, first of all, high coverage. How well did instruments that we looked at identify or cover the construct of intercultural competence? And I've listed all of the article citations, and you'll see why they're grouped in a particular way. But of the 68 that we reviewed, there were 23 instruments that seemed to do, about 1/3 of the instruments seemed to do a very good job of adequately covering, that is, covering most of what people were talking about when they talked about intercultural competence. The next question was, how valid and reliable are they? And what we found there was that there were instruments, and you can see the overlap, there were instruments that had high coverage and high reliability. There were other instruments, the bottom two clusters, that had high reliability and validity, but didn't have quite as comprehensive a coverage. And then the last consideration, which were, I just called most popular, but this is which were, according to the subject matter experts, most widely accepted or recognized, and which were most widely used. And you can see again, there were there were items that had high coverage and were popular, but were not viewed as reliable or valid. And as we break that down, and what we find right in the middle are two assessment tools that are particularly strong, that hit the right note on all three. And you don't have to go to the references. I'll tell you the first instrument listed, the Yang et al., is the CQ instrument. And the second one is the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale. Now, if you move slightly to the right in the group that had high coverage and high acceptance, you'll see another citation for Mendenhall et al. That is the Global Competencies Inventory. And the reason it was not highly rated was that the level of reporting on that in 2012 did not reflect the full extent, and there haven't been any technical reports published on the GCI since then, and so the available data. And so I'll just note that were the data updated from the 2012 technical report, the GCI would fall into that location with the CQ and the IES. And so that's what we've seen from an extraordinary comprehensive review of all of the intercultural assessment tools that are out there and available for use. I'm going to turn it over to Chris now. He's going to talk about the study that he was involved in that has to do with what these assessments get used for. Chris?
One of the many organizations I have the joy of participating in is the World Council on Global and Intercultural Competence. It's a virtual organization of interculturalists from around the world studying different impacts and how this work gets done. And recently they came out with a book just last May called Current Perspectives on Intercultural and Global Competence. It's several chapters on all sorts of topics within there. Fascinating read, a free download, by the way. And I got to work with this amazing team. I love my team so much on the practice of assessing intercultural competence, a preliminary study. So our goal was just to look at what's going on out there, who's doing what, where, and why, and see if we can get a handle on what the practice is. Okay. It was rich. The link is down there, and we'll give you a link when we send out the materials for the free download. Remembering this is a preliminary study, and we worked really hard to reach how this all came together. But we ended up with 227 respondents in 50 different countries, most from the US. Most worked in education, secondary or higher education. And the most common disciplines were from the arts and languages and business education. So right there, that gives you an idea of what perspective we're looking at. Many of you who are on right now don't work in any of those fields, and that doesn't mean that it shouldn't apply to you. It's just a matter of reaching you and getting people who don't work in education to answer an online survey. We did get it out to all those countries, and we had it in something like 9 different languages. Never done this in my life, but this group was amazing as linguists. You put out something and say you want it translated and back translated to make sure it was adequate, and it came back in 7 days. Brilliant work. Here's what we learned. Of our audience, 57% of people actually assessed intercultural competence at all. The other ones did not. Of those, the majority, 87%, use a mixed method approach, meaning they use both quantitative and qualitative. 30% use qualitative, 15% use quantitative solely. Most are using both formative and summative assessment practices. So they're looking at where you start, who are you, what's in the room, what do we know about you, and what happened as a result. Only 30 or 35% use either or summative or formative alone. The majority are using assessment, 81%, assessment as learning. So the assessment that is gathered is given to the students, and the students are able to look at it and engage it and use it for their own development. It's a very powerful practice. Only 19% only use it as gathering data for research and don't get back to the students. 67% are using it at their course or workshop or training level, okay? 11% are looking at the program-wide or department-wide input, what's happening around this work, and only 5 to 7% are looking at organizational campus-wide. I find that troubling. I like aggregate data, but it is what it is. It's the practice. And then finally, 63% are using it as a needs assessment or analysis for individual development. They want people to grow. And that's their primary reason for doing this. 32% are using it in a pre-post impact, what's going on. 11% are using it for individual to team development, and only 8% are using it for career or academic advising. That's our preliminary finding. A lot more can be done. The point of this project was to get it started and to replicate it every 3 to 5 years and gather more data and get a richer data pool. But I think it's informative in and of itself. And we were particularly pleased to have so many people participate from around the world. Alan, are there any burning questions we need to answer now, or we go right on to Mike and his hot 10 topics?
Let's go right on to Mike, because I think one of the questions directly addresses the material he'll cover.
Great. Okay, guys. Mike, you're on.
Thank you, Chris. So Alan, jump to the first slide, if you would. Top 10 questions. So over the years, we have pulled together a kind of a top 10 list of the questions that we most frequently get from potential users of psychometric surveys. Now, let me back up and qualify this as an option and not necessarily a recommendation. These top 10 questions are related specifically to how we might evaluate quantitative self-report survey instruments and their reliability and their validity, how useful they could potentially be. They're not the only way of certainly evaluating cross-cultural competencies. There are strengths and weaknesses to this approach. One of the strengths is clearly you can, ask lots of questions in a short period of time to a lot of people, and you can take something that is an internal psychological trait or disposition or construct and turn it into data. And that data can be put into spreadsheets. You can calculate norms, trajectories. You can compare people against database populations and kind of see where they are. The weaknesses are that it aggregates across lots of information. It doesn't necessarily help you diagnose or give you the end-all be-all picture of each individual in your group. That's something that usually can be mediated or remedied during a follow-on debrief with good coaches who know how to interpret a profile report from a given assessment. So in short, the thinking behind quantitative psychometric tools is captured in the idea that comes from management theory, which is what you can measure, you can manage, at least more systematically and at a larger scale. So with that in mind, there are a couple of things to keep in mind with these self-report kinds of surveys and assessment questionnaires. The first one we have to ask is whether or not the measure is reliable. And there are two main concepts here that you often hear thrown about as it relates to describing how, quote, good an assessment is. One is reliability and one is validity. The difference is simply this. Reliability means that your measure is free from random error. And what we mean by random error is if people came back and they took the assessment over and over and over again, would they get close to the same score each time? assuming that whatever the assessment measures is not changing. A fun way to illustrate this example that I use in my class is I have students take out an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and measure the length from top to bottom using their thumb knuckle as their measuring stick. And so I have them repeat that 3 times. I have everybody report out their numbers. I put them on the flip chart or the whiteboard in the front of the room, and we can compare how people differ in terms of the number of thumb knuckle units they report for an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It's kind of fun because even though everybody has a slightly different size in terms of their thumb knuckle unit, and so they will get systematic differences, some people will often get, as they repeat that trial for themselves 3 times, will get 3 different numbers. That's the reliability question. You go to the next slide, Alan. The validity question is whether or not a thumb knuckle unit is a systematically appropriate measure for length, and the answer is yeah, not really, because it's not standard for people. And so one of the things that we look at with the question of validity is that the idea of measuring what we purport to measure can be evaluated across content, predictive, convergent, face, and differential validity. And they all give us a different window into aspects of an assessment's quality and rigor. So the first one has to do with content validity. I'm just going to hit that real quickly on the next slide, Alan. This relates to a phrase Alan used, which is nomological net, which is a big word Alan and I use because they pay us to do that as professors. But the simple way of thinking about it is simply the content domain, which means what is it that your assessment intends to measure? This is really important when it comes to deciding which assessments you want. Because the picture that I have on this slide with the fellow's got the bubble with the question mark. I've actually got another picture I use, which is the picture of a street lamp in the corner of a dark parking lot. It's an empty parking lot at the top of a hill from a beach. And the story I tell is there's a fellow pulls into that parking lot late at night. It's dark, and he sees a man over looking very carefully in the ground underneath the spotlight at the end of the parking lot. And he watches for a minute, and it appears obvious the man is looking for something. And so, being a good Samaritan, the fellow parks his car and walks over to the man who's searching for something under the light, and he asks him, are you looking for something? The man says, yes, I lost my car keys and I need to find them. And the good Samaritan says, well, let me help. And so they start to look around, they expand the pattern, they don't see it. After about 20 minutes or so, the good Samaritan turns to the man and says, this is just perplexing. Are you sure you lost your keys up here? And the man says, oh, no, I lost them down on the beach. And the good Samaritan asked, well, then why are you looking for them up here? And the man said, well, the light's much better. So the idea behind it is if you need an assessment, for example, to measure your student progress in a cross-cultural management class, or perhaps the growth that occurs among your students after a study abroad program. It's easy to, go and do a Google search or maybe even ask colleagues, what kind of assessments have you used? And, Alan mentioned that they surveyed in his study over 100 different tools and settled on about, 68 of those. And so there are a lot to choose from. And if you don't step back and ask yourself thoughtfully, well, what is the content domain of each of these potential surveys I could use? And you select one that's easy or convenient or available or maybe, cheap enough to fit within your budget or possibly even free. You might be like the fellow looking for his lost keys in the parking lot just because there's a light there. Content validity means the measure is free from contamination and deficiency with regard to the competencies that it has purported to measure. Go to the next slide, if you would, Alan, because once you have content validity, then we run into another question, which is, can the scores on your assessment actually help you predict other scores? This is the quantitative statistical methodology part of why data measurement can be useful. For example, one of the things we know from biological measurements is a person's weight can help predict their height. Now, it's not a perfect measure, but you can get relatively close, right? So if I tell you I'm talking about a male individual weighs 200 pounds, you could probably even guess that he's not 2 years of age. You could probably guess that he's, on average going to be maybe 6 feet tall or something in that neighborhood. Now, it's not going to be precise, but it can get you in the ballpark. Full disclosure, I am one of the developers of the GCI, which is the Global Competencies Inventory. And so if this does come across as a bit of a sales pitch, I apologize. That's not the intention. It is simply that I know this instrument well, and I've had a chance to be involved with the details and the research and the studies that have been done on this. And so one of the things that we have found with our global competencies inventory, can you do the... This was actually a very interesting study that was done by a colleague of ours who was trying to predict Japanese language acquisition by Chinese students who were coming to Japan to study for a semester abroad in an immersive Japanese language program. And if you can't see these numbers, the short story is that scores that were attained in a pre-program assessment of the GCI were later correlated with language proficiency in Japanese of those Chinese students at the end of the semester. And these are the correlations between the GCI scores and foreign language acquisition. And if any of you know how to read and interpret these zero order correlations, these are just phenomenal. I've rarely ever seen relationships this strong. But this is the idea of predictive validity. That is, score on one thing can help you predict what the scores will be on some other trait of interest in an expected and related fashion. So if you can go back to the other slides, Alan. In a similar way, convergent valid means that an assessment of a construct like empathy, if it's defined the same way and measured the same way, ought to be highly correlated with other measures of empathy in other assessments. That's simply what it means. And it's a way of validating and confirming that one scale of empathy is doing the same thing as all the other scales of empathy, and they fit together and they converge. Number 5, actually skip that one, Alan. We can come back if there are more questions. 5 is face validity. Okay, face validity is simply whether or not the assessment on its face appears to be appropriate or seems to be appropriate for the supposed constructs that it's measuring. Face validity is more about marketing and perception than it is about the measure's actual psychometric validity. And sometimes you can have a very useful and effective treatment, even though it may not have face validity. Best example I can give you this is years ago when I was a young boy, had an ear infection. My parents took me to the doctor. Doctor says, yep, it's an ear infection. Here's a prescription for some antibiotics, some ear drops. So I'm a little kid. I trust my mom and dad. They go to the pharmacy, they get the prescriptions. We go home. My mom puts a couple of drops in my ear uh, and kind of stung a little bit. And I asked my mom, what in the world are those drops? And she says, well, it's penicillin. I said, what's that? She says, they make it out of mold on bread. And I said, wait a minute. You're telling me that I have an ear infection and that you can take mold from a bread and turn it into eardrops and that will cure my ear infection? She says, yes. I said, that seems absolutely preposterous. And yet it works. On the face of it, 100 years ago, if someone came to you and said the mold on a bread can treat a bacterial infection, we would say that's nonsense. But the fact of the matter is it works. On the other hand, you can have something that is highly face valid, that it appears to be appropriate, that it appears to be useful, and may not necessarily have these other types of validity. But what we've found over the years is that when it comes to persuading stakeholders for a study that a measure or an assessment is actually appropriate and useful, face validity helps, even though it may or may not necessarily square with the psychometric validity. So hit the next one, Alan, if you would, number 6. Differential validity is also sometimes referred to as cross-cultural validity. That is, does the measure of the intended trait or attribute captured in a way that's free from cultural or demographic biases? Now, here's what that would look like. If you go to the next slide, Alan, each of these 2 bar charts represent a bell curve of a distribution on, let's say, a personality score of extroversion. Okay, personality, big 5 personality trait of extroversion. If we gave the exact same extroversion measure to a population of Anglos and we distributed their scores on a bell curve, it would be the top, the bar at the top, where that block in the middle represents the middle 2/3 of the bell curve, and the 2 lines going out to the left and right would be the extreme highs and lows. If you took that exact same extroversion scale and gave it to, say, Asians, and their distribution of scores was that second bar on the bottom, the difference between them would lead us to the conclusion that that scale of extroversion is not differentially valid. In other words, it works one way systematically for one group and one way for another. Differential validity, however, would look like this next slide, which is a very high overlap between the 2 distributions. And in fact, what we would say from the relationship with these distributions is that the difference between the Anglos and the Asians is much, much smaller, the between group difference, than the within group difference, because on this extroversion scale, you could have people from both these demographic groups who range across the entire scope of scores. And in fact, this is the much more likely profile that we see on personality traits and predispositions. So the idea that we have differential validity means you don't have to worry about renorming your assessment to different groups and different demographic profiles. If there's more interest in that, we can talk about it later, but that's the kind of thing that a good, valid, differential valid assessment should be able to provide in their technical reports if you ask for them. So number 7, this relates in large measure, the last slide and this slide relate to the question that Bettina asked in the chat a few minutes ago, which is the idea of having an assessment that is free from gaming, right? So in some situations, transparent items may be subject to response bias when the people taking the assessment are motivated to get a particular score or want to look a particular way. Along with transparent items, this depends also on the individual's motivation to gain their scores to get that profile. So you got two things going on. If somebody is really worried about their profile, they need to be able to identify items as being connected to a positive profile that they want, and then they have to be able to respond in ways that will get them the score that they want. Less transparent items tend to lower the likelihood of gaming, but they can usually mean trading away face validity. One strategy, though, for capturing a socially desirable or gaming strategy is something called a social desirability index scale, which you do find in some scales. It's not universal, but it's usually there. So go to the next slide, Alan, and I'll just mention this real quickly. These are hidden items that create a social desirability scale that are randomly spread throughout a survey. So there might be 6, 7, 8 of these social desirability scales randomly spread, throughout 75 or 100 items on a psychometric survey. And the kind of questions they include are the samples that we have at the bottom of the slide. If you read those kind of items, what you will find is they assess the degree to which somebody is going through and answering the survey questions and claiming to have much higher and unlikely virtues than you would typically see. They're not impossible virtues, but unlikely. And so assessments that have a social desirability index scale built into them can flag a profile that has a very, very high social desirability score as the potential that somebody may have responded to get a particularly favorable profile. It doesn't necessarily invalidate the scores, but it does give you an opportunity to maybe debrief with the person and ask them, kind of what they're thinking, what their strategy is. Do they have any concerns or worries about the assessment results, how their profile or their scores were going to be used, and so on. So that's something to take into account. Number 8 has to do with the question of the intended use. Are you going to use it for staffing and placement decisions, in which case things like predictive validity may be going to be much more important to you, especially if they have been validated according to the more rigorous professional employment testing standards that not all assessments do. If you're going to be using it for coaching and development, you will want something that's more robust and can give you more qualitative insights for being built into a professional development plan. So a lot of that has to do with an assessment that would be much more useful in the hands of a development coach to work with individuals, whether it's students, whether it's managers, whether it's executives, whatever it might be. Educational outcomes, student outcomes, assurance of learning, accreditation, and so on. Number 9, next slide, has to do with how easy and practical it is to get and used. What are the costs, cost per use, licensing costs, time requirements to administer, for respondents to complete, specialized trainer qualification processes. Those are other things to keep into account as you work through your decision process. And then number 10 is what sorts of administrative options are available, meaning online, paper and pencil, how are reports and profiles delivered, and so on. Last thing I have is, I have to admit, this is kind of tongue in cheek, but number 11 is, will it also do my laundry? And what I mean by that is simply be wary of claims that developers make that cannot reasonably be expected. If that's the case, you probably need to dial back your confidence that the other claims that the developers are making are justified or maybe a bit hyperbolic. So the next slide is just kind of a summary of all this, which it's pretty busy. And if you're interested in a reference, this is from a chapter in a book that Alan and I have written. We've updated several times over the years. Let me go back and end with this, a little more fine-tuned response to Bettina's question of whether or not self-report assessments can over or underestimate competence. And I guess the best way for me to answer that is to talk about two categories of competence. One has to do with traits and dispositions, and the other has to do with actual behavioral skills. As a category, psychometric self-report assessments are much, much stronger at measuring traits and predispositions. Traits and predispositions do not necessarily translate into a behavioral repertoire that most of us would say that's competence. And the reason is the context matters significantly as you move from traits and dispositions to actual exhibited behaviors, right? So somebody who is really high on extroversion, for example, that's their trait and that's their preference. So when I talk about these psychological traits and preferences, a good image I used to think about them is essentially a river current or a stream, right? Our psychological traits and predispositions are both the strength and the quantity of that flowing water in that stream or that river. If for some reason you need to move upstream against that current, most of us could do it, but at a cost. And it really depends on what our motivation is. It really depends on what's at stake. It really depends on how much energy it takes for us to work against our natural predispositions, and how strong the current of our predispositions are. So, for example, if I'm highly extroverted and my wife and I are driving over to her family for Thanksgiving dinner, when I get there, my natural inclination is going to be to engage with everybody, to ask questions, to talk, to chat. But if on the drive over to my in-laws, my wife says, by the way, when we get there for dinner, do not make eye contact with my uncle. Do not talk to my question about, do not talk to my cousin about anything related to politics. Do not talk to my aunt or my grandmother about religion. Other than that, you'll be fine. And so I do the calculation in my head and say, okay, this is going to be an uncomfortable afternoon if I ask the wrong person the wrong question or make eye contact in the wrong way. So what I do for the afternoon is I turn into behaviorally what people who saw me would describe as an introvert. It's not that I have changed into an introvert. It's that my behavior is now reflecting the context of a very powerful situation with all kinds of unwanted consequences if I don't comply. So that, I think, is a useful way for understanding the difference between what we see in a profile based on someone's responses to the items on a self-report inventory and the observed behaviors that most of us would describe as competence. So I hope that helped with your question, Bettina. If not, we can follow up. And I'm going to turn this back to you, Alan.
I'm going to throw this back to you, Mike, and also bring in Chris as well. Leighton asked the question, do you have any suggestions for assessments that look at behavior associated with intercultural competence? As you mentioned, there's not always a connection between the traits and behaviors.
Yeah,
I'll take it.
this is where a really good coach who can help you understand the profile and translate in that to a development plan. But Chris, why don't you jump in there?
Yeah, this is where what we found in the other study where the mixed method approach works. What you'll see, say for example, extroversion or the need for empathy, good listening and engagement is required of this particular situation. There's a practice that needs to be developed. And with a good assessment plan, you can develop a practice, a personal development plan that says, yes, I'm going to learn to do this differently or betterly or better. And then it's a matter of tracking that behavior over time and the practice of it, and either reusing the psychometric at a later date to see if it shifted, and or using some type of work sample or study that says, oh, this is how I used to. Basically, the core is the reflection on the learning, and all reflection is surrounded around the idea of I used to say or think this, now I say or think or do that. So what changed? And what is the evidence of it? And what will be evidence to participant A that they have learned the behavior and are now doing it differently will be articulated differently for each one of them. So having a way to gather that evidence and look at it to see what it was. So usually following up with a practice, an actual development plan, and some mechanism to collect the fact that a change happened is the best answer I can give you. Does that answer your question, Leighton? Feel free to unmute.
Let me follow up on that, Chris, because there are a few assessments that do actually measure behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these, as Mike has discussed, are psychometric assessments. And before I answer that question, let me also say that when it comes to measuring intercultural competencies, there are not just a range of constructs or subdimensions like resilience, empathy, etc., but they're also qualitatively different, and that's what's covered by the notion of traits or attitudes. And we can add into that cognitive orientations, knowledge bases that contribute, and then of course behaviors. And so the question is, when you look at any assessment, which of those qualitative competencies are you considering? And many of the assessments tap into one or two of those. It's rare for assessment, but one of the assessments that does tap into it is the CQ, but not the what I would refer to as the Ang and early CQ, which is currently the most widely used one. But there is a different CQ instrument developed by Dave Thomas and colleagues. And so if you go to the article I mentioned, the International Business Review, and look for Thomas in the citations, it's also in the analysis that we do, but go right to the citations, you can find that one. And one of the things that makes Thomas's assessment so interesting is that it does measure behavioral characteristics, behavioral properties. Now, of course, one of the challenges of that is it's a highly involved assessment that involves role playing and simulated situations. The other place you may find assessments that tackle that would be in what are called assessment centers. And that's not a physical location, but that's usually a collection of different assessment methods, which might include psychometric tests, but also would include simulated events or activities as well.
Just to build on what Alan's saying, I would also echo the behavioral repertoire that would reflect that aspect of competence is something that I'm always suspect of when we ask people to rate their own behaviors, which is why we need the 360 assessment peer evaluations, or maybe in-depth feedback on behaviors exhibited in role play scenarios. On the other hand, the internal psychological states that you capture through a psychometric assessment, where you're asking people about attitudes and traits and predispositions, is not really something other people who even who know us well can evaluate. But the combination of the two can be quite powerful. And the interesting thing that I have found over the years when it comes to this kind of coaching and feedback and behavioral evaluation is that most of us, as a very predictable rule of thumb, tend to evaluate our own behavior based on our motives and intentions, whereas other people tend to evaluate our impact based on the behaviors that they observed. So what that means is we tend to give ourselves a much more lenient benefit of the doubt when it comes to our cross-cultural impact than others do. And we tend to be much more harsh in evaluating others. It's what psychologists refer to as the attribution bias.
Hey, we're coming up on the end of the hour. I'm sure there is much more that we could talk about and other questions you might have. Let me encourage you, if you do have questions, to please feel free to follow up with us. You can reach us at thekozigroup.com. Thank you for joining us, and we wish you well as you move forward from here in your work in intercultural settings.